Okay, so we understand that as a result of the podcast, a lot of people started to inquire about the technology. It might be a stretch for me to say it's the world's first, but we're going to play with that one anyway. So let's. I'm very left-handed, so I may get this totally wrong. So let's kick off. Okay, so a bit of a background and disclosure. I'm one of those evil guys. I spent my first 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so from 81 to 91, I worked for European, North American companies. But in 91, I joined a small little agency in the UK and the US called Medical Education Network. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because we had a really interesting, novel database of medical meetings, medical conferences. When I joined that company, we monitored 6,500 English language medical conferences. When I left that company 10 years on, when we sold the business, we were monitoring 47,500 English language medical conferences. And this feeds in with what Grant and Marianne was talking about yesterday, about the deception and about the commerciality of medical research, because very little of that increased research was independent. It was all drug industry sponsored. Hey, and I was part of that. But what really kicked our business, and our business got bought out by a North American group called Rogers in 2001, was that I think it's around 1995, the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet published a joint editorial decrying the fact there was no negative data. Well, of course there's no negative data. If you spent $2 million putting a study together and the results are ambivalent or worse, you're not going to get it published. It's not going through peer review. But what does happen is it goes to Congress, because the researcher has to have his day in the limelight. So the methodology gets presented. The interim results get presented. And what we were able to do as a company, and I know I'm deviating, but I think it's really critical, is that we could analyse that data, look at that data, and that data still exists today. And we could therefore package information about Pfizer's drug and sell it to Bristol Myers, and about Bristol Myers drug and sell it to Glaxo, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if you look, and actually in the really early days, we did some work with Cochrane, okay, just trying to, but we are so, as clinicians and as industry, we're so geared up around this whole concept of peer review and publication being the be-all and end-all of data, we forget the fact that there are these jollies going on all over the world. I've noticed that there's never a medical conference in an ugly area. You don't get them in Bratislava, you really don't, or where I come from, in my part of London. So they're always in some nice place like this. Anyway, I digress. So we sold the business in 2001. I moved to Perth in 2005. I put this up just to make most of you jealous, because that's the view from my office at home. Okay, that's the sunset I see every evening. And if there is a better sunset in the world than Perth, I've yet to see it. Okay, 10 years ago this month, I met some guys who were to really change the course of the second half of my life. And in 2011, we formed a group which became known as Metabolic Health Solutions. And we have a small team here in the UK, and we have a sort of modest ambition of taking metabolic testing to the world. So why? Well, it's pretty obvious. And whilst global warming is clearly a significant problem, okay, what we face with every day, and what you guys face as clinicians and researchers face every day, is an urgent, pressing issue. And why? Well, we know that obesity is a driver for metabolic disease. And actually what's really interesting is when I first became interested in this, generally, if you were overweight, it was your fault. You're lazy. You ate too much. An industry, and I came from a government meeting, a West Australian meeting on Wednesday, whereby the whole day was a summit about how we could tackle this. It's now a public health problem only because government realised just how expensive it is. So we know that people are getting heavier. We know that obesity links to many other metabolic diseases, and that was described yesterday. And in fact, just a few weeks ago at EASD, the European Diabetes Meeting, Novo Nordisk published some data that suggested that there may be 195 obesity-related metabolic disorders. The cynic might say they're just trying to grow market share, but hey-ho, it's a major issue. So let's go back, and we know that obesity is directly related to a number of deaths. This stat says it's more than war and tobacco combined. In Australia, I think it's by 2025 that the spend on obesity will be greater than the defence budget. Okay, so it's a significant and growing problem, and data this year suggesting we're now impacting on not just the quality of people's lives, but the longevity as well. So it's a really significant issue. So let's go back to 10 years ago. And I don't draw very well, and I do steal other people's artwork. So 10 years ago, I got involved with a couple of researchers and former Olympic athletes who were looking at using pulsed electromagnetic fields to help athletes recover more quickly from exercise stress. And that has no relevance other than say, but what fascinated me was this. And it's a metabolic cart. And I knew nothing about it. We're really siloed in medicine. Okay, I'm a drugs guy, so if it's not a drug, I think it's hooky, But this metabolic cart, when I was tested, under this sort of space canopy, it told me some really interesting things. Everybody has a journey, a personal story, except one researcher that I've come across, the wonderful Karen Zinn. And I listened to one of her talks, where everybody else had talked about their personal journey, how they'd lost 35 kilos, how they'd done this. And Karen said, I don't have a journey. Well, I don't either. I've never really been overweight. I'm only 4 kilos heavier than when I stopped playing rugby. But what it told me was my metabolic rate, how many calories I needed. It told me what kind of fuels I was using to generate that energy, whether I was generating energy from fats, I wasn't very well, or from sugars, I was. And it told me about my energy efficiency, which was still reasonable given I'm still pretty active as a now 60-year-old playing hockey with my son. But it reminded me of these engine analyzers that you get when you take your car in. Now, of course, this is VW, so the data's likely to be fraudulent. But you get the message. Okay. So I then started one of the great things about having this former database is I could go back and look at various data. Okay, and I realised there was another kind of technology that used metabolism. And actually, I only learnt yesterday from Stephen Finey that it's called a prison cell. Okay, so it's a metabolic chamber. Essentially, it's a sealed room. And the way these things work is they pump water around the outside of it, and they measure the temperature change in that water. And here's a modern version of that prison cell. This is from NIH in Bethesda. This is one of the metabolic chambers that is run by Kong Chen and Kevin Hall. This is $3 million, okay? And I think there are 37 in the US. There's one in Australia, and it hasn't worked since 2009 at Wollongong, okay? So, and if you're interested in this sort of technology, then the Canadian writer and blogger Julia Bellos wrote a really good piece on having spent a day there. And I'd urge you to read it. It's quite interesting. Okay, so let's talk about what lies beneath this, and that's calorimetry. Calor, heat, rimetry, measurement. Okay, so as you can see from this lithograph, it's not new. Okay, in fact, the fundamental science is some 300 years old, really driven by the French. They're good at something, apart from food. Okay, and Antoine Lavoisier was really the father of this. In fact, he stole ideas from James Black, a Scottish scientist. But he was the first to develop. There are no French in the room, are there? Perhaps should have qualified first. He understood the relationship between heat and oxygen. And the way I normally describe this is if you remember back to school with a Bunsen burner, okay, and you close the O-ring off on the Bunsen burner, and all the boys put their hands through, and the flame's orange, and we're all brave, okay? And you open the O-ring up, okay, and the oxygen comes in, and the flame burns blue, and only the really stupid boys put their hands through, okay? I used to say, or the Irish, but I don't do that anymore. So, exactly. That's why I don't say it anymore. Okay. And I see that we're a really tech group here, with our smartphones and our Apple Watches and our Fitbits and our Garmins and everything. And on those watches, you've got a little calculation that's estimating your metabolic rate. Okay. Now, the grandfather of that calculation, the Harris-Benedict equation, actually will be a century old next year. And what's really fascinating, and I'm sorry, just to get political for 1 second, is that the DAA, the Dietitian Association of Australia, are actually making that the key theme of the topic. So dietetics is moving into the field of energy metabolism. So it's not new. So what are we doing? What are we actually measuring when we use this technology? Well, essentially, depending on what we're using, if we use a metabolic chamber, we're really measuring heat, as I said before. I don't know where the rest of my graph is. But if we're using a metabolic carb, then really we're looking to measure oxygen, and we're looking to measure carbon dioxide. And by measuring that, if the equation is sort of, we take substrate, food, carbohydrate or fat, okay, we apply some oxygen, we use a small amount of energy, we generate energy, and we generate byproducts. So here's a question for you. Rod's asked me to make it rhetorical. What question, when asked in 2015, did 98% of physicians, actually health professionals, qualifying, in New South Wales and Victoria get wrong? It was only 2,000. Okay, so it may not have been any of you. Okay, I've been asked to make it rhetorical. So I'll tell you, where does the weight go when we lose it? And of course, when I first started using this slide, no one knew. Now everybody knows. We breathe it out. And so calorimetry is that process of being able to measure what it is we breathe out, those respiratory gases. Okay. So we can do a couple of other things as well. We can also look at substrate. We can look at what fuels we're using to generate energy. And there's various equations, but you'll hear people talk about RQ, respiratory quotient. That was the thing that excited people on this podcast. Accurately, and I apologise if there are physiologists in the room, we're really, at the mouth, we're measuring respiratory exchange ratio, not RQ. That occurs at the cell. But essentially, carbohydrate generates more carbon dioxide per molar value of oxygen than fats do. So for about the last 50 years, we've been able to use a really simple lookup table based on a dimensionless ratio. And so you might see, and I think some of you may have listened to Richard Morris, sort of trump the fact that his RQ is really good. He was a really great fat burner. But a lot of the patients that are seen aren't. And I just want to cover that. But before I do, I just want to think about metabolic rate in the context of our energy requirements. What we're measuring and what they're measuring generally in the chamber is the energy we require to do what we're doing now. Be alive, sit there, resting, okay? And that's the vast majority of our energy, and it's called our basal metabolic rate, or in fact, we measure resting metabolic rate, okay? On top of that, we have a small amount of energy demand to actually convert that food into fuel, 6 to 10%. And we have maybe, depending on our fitness status, we maybe have somewhere between 15 and 25% of energy to lose weight. So when Grant was saying yesterday, this whole idea about you can't outrun a bad diet, it's because the vast majority of the energy intake is not used for activity, okay? It's used to keep us alive. Now, does that mean exercise is not important? Absolutely not. And there are some really good cellular reasons why, okay? But in terms of fundamental weight loss, just cutting calories means that you end up sort of, and I think Kevin Hall in particular showed this when they took the biggest loser group and followed them up over 6 years. If you cut calories, what happens is your metabolic rate declines. It becomes difficult for that metabolic rate to change. So I want to come back to your watch and that equation that's 100 years old. So this is from Gary Foster it's 30 years old. Gary Foster was at Temple at the time, he's moved on. So this is quintiles of women, same height, same weight, and the equations that you have in your watch say that you should all need the same energy, the same metabolism. But actually what he found was there was a variation of plus or minus 30%. That's significant. If you're a clinician, if you're looking at managing that, 30% difference, plus or minus, from 1,260 calories to 2,200. And it's not isolated to that one equation. There's now over 140 equations developed since 1919 because, they don't take into account Chinese, they don't take into account sort of Japanese, they don't take da-da-da-da-da-da. In fact, the equation was originally done in male university students. So they didn't take into account women at all. All right, so these equations generally now accepted that predictive population equations shouldn't be used in clinical care. But it's very easy to say that, but difficult if you don't have a tool to deal with it. I just want to give you a real life example here. So this is a tier 3 centre in Scotland, uses our technology. So tier 3, so the way obesity is managed in the UK is tier 1, do it yourself. Tier 2, go and see a GP. Okay, tier 3, go and see a specialist centre, really as a gatekeeper for bariatric surgery, and tier 4 is surgery. Okay, so there's 3 guys here. They're all broadly similar. Okay, they use a different calculation called Mifflin. Okay, Mifflin-Cindura. And you can see somewhere between 3,300 calories and 3,700 calories. But I want you to particularly look at the 2 guys on the right-hand side. They're virtually identical. A few years difference in age. They're both about 190 tall. They're both about 180 heavy. Mifflin says that there's less than sort of 70 calories difference between their energy requirements, and yet when measured, there's 1,300 calories difference. Okay. I've highlighted in blue that the guy on the right-hand side that had the lower energy demand was actually a much better fat burner, and that might move towards the idea that maybe he was more efficient in the way he used his energy than the others. So you just can't look at someone. So there are benefits to get a reliable, accurate measure. Okay, a number of you in the audience may be sitting there saying, yeah, I've got a slow metabolism. I've always had a slow metabolism. Okay, the reality is metabolism is really linked to body surface area. It's highly unlikely that you have a slow metabolism. Very few do. The people that we see in clinic, and I'll explain where clinic comes from in a moment, tend to be repeat dieters. As Hall showed, they starve, they eat, they change, they starve, they change, they starve, they change, and all the time you get this metabolic decline. As I said earlier, we can look at substrate, we can look at what fuels you're using to generate energy, and I think there's clearly, my engineers in my group talk about root cause. And they have a view, and we have a view, that root cause is actually impaired fat utilization. So root cause to most metabolic health disorders is impaired fat utilization. It might be stating the obvious, but it's not something that's often discussed. Okay. And obviously, the final sort of elements is we can look at whether or not the regime that we're using can be validated. One practitioner, in fact, somebody asked yesterday, one practitioner that we have that uses his patient calls it a cheat machine because if they're not doing it, shows up. Now, I just want to cover a couple of other things. This graph in the top right-hand corner is the relationship between alcohol and fat oxidation. Okay, I've made it small because it's a sensitive subject. Particularly seeing those of us that were at dinner last night. Okay. But we're designed to burn fat. It's what we're designed to do. And at rest, we're designed to generate 70 to 80% of our energy from fat stores. Those of you that will have gone through McArdle and Catch in your undergrad days will know those numbers. But actually, the way we eat today, and it's worse if we add snacking in, we spend most of our life, and we have Ted Naiman to thank for this graphic, we spend most of our life in a fat storage mode and very little time in a fat burning mode. One of the interesting things, something that we focus on quite heavily, is why sleep, good quality sleep, is such a good time to burn fat. And again, it comes back to this notion that we want to measure things at rest. If you're sleeping well, you're definitely at rest. So, challenge for us. And I'm sorry it's taken me 13 minutes to get there, but it's a backstory. Okay, could we build something that people could use? Now, I have to declare, we had no intention of coming to meetings like this. People don't go and see a doctor or a health professional to lose weight. They go to a gym, they go to a spa. Gyms inherently understand energy. You're not burning enough, work harder. Okay, so we put this machine together, and you can see a first prototype. This is one of my exercise physiologists doing the Instagram moment. And in end of 2012, we had a validation study. We thought it might be a good idea to see if it actually worked. And we were lucky enough to find a world-leading energy metabolism specialist in Mario Suarez. And Mario's a really traditional medical research, MD, PhD, but a really traditional researcher. He likes doing research. He doesn't like spending his time, as Catherine said yesterday, trying to find grants. Okay, and we were really he's heavily published, and he just happened to be up the road. And as a real testament to the quality of our business, we had no idea he was there until we were looked for a validation study. Mario said, "Are you making this a medical device?" No, why? I said, "Well, we'd use it, it's accurate." There's a thing called a Douglas bag, which is the standard technology for referencing. So we went through the process of umming and ahhing, working out if we could afford it. We'd put all the money in ourselves. And we decided we'd make this a medical device. So what do you do when you've got 3 prototypes and you can't sell any of them because you're waiting for medical device approval, which in our case took 2 years. We weren't structured to be a medical device company. Well, you open a clinic. So we recruited a young exercise physiologist, worked with a dietitian that was prepared to understand what we were trying to do, and literally gave them a clean sheet of paper and said, "You've got 3 months to go through the literature. We're looking for you to build a protocol that uses indirect calorimetry out of a research setting." And this is a simplified graphic that got put together. Really, our technology, that's the cogs at the top. Want to look at what's happening to your metabolism? That's the pistons, okay? To see if we can get you burning fat, because that's fundamentally what it's all about. And actually, perhaps most importantly, see if we can protect your muscle mass. Because as we say to patients now, I don't see patients, I have a declaration, but when you are heavy, you're carrying a lot of muscle. And traditional weight loss loses muscle in equivalency to fat. But what we want to do is protect that muscle they have. So if we can individualize a strategy that allows us to do that. Now, this is all pre-low carb for me. I'm sort of dietary agnostic. I should qualify. I can't stand eating rubbish food. Never have. But a colleague of mine from the UK, Malcolm Kendrick, sent me Gary Taub's book, and I'd read Steve Finey's book. I'd read the sports part of Steve Finey's book, the second one first, because I'm curious like that. And we were starting to get some interesting data, and I just want to share a little bit of this. So this is from early on. 60% of people that we saw fasted first time at clinic, we published it at ANZOS as a poster a couple of years ago, weren't generating optimal levels of fat, which is strange, because what you've come to us to do is to lose fat. And in fact, around about 25% weren't generating any energy from fat stores at all. So we started to read that maybe a low carbohydrate approach might be a way to deal with that. And that coincided with, so that was around about the end of 2014. And so I'd seen, in fact, I got a feed for this low carb meeting in Cape Town sort of thing that was, I'd never been to South Africa. I thought it'd be great. Okay. And of course, and Steve and I were talking yesterday, I genuinely believe, as important as what we do here in Low Carb Down Under, that meeting was transformative in the way we think about nutrition and the way we think about metabolic health. And bringing such an eclectic group of people together and it really opened my eyes. So we came back and said, we have to go low carb. Okay. So I just want to, there are loads of confounders in our results, but I want to put it up anyway, as much to say that in fact, we rarely see people with uncomplicated obesity. We see people with insulin resistance, diabetes, we see people with PCOS and fertility. We have now 3 clinics, 2 here and 1 in the UK. And our numbers are full of confounders, and we've just given all of our numbers. We also have a whole bunch of pathology that we started using to an independent group to actually evaluate that data now. We do some body composition measurements. I want to focus on just one patient if I can. That's a 33-year-old struggling with postpartum weight loss. Not from a first child, but from a second child. So it was a cumulative effect, okay? She'd been to Weight Watchers, heavy exercise, no result, She was a former gym centre manager. So she thought the route to success would be just work harder, okay? The dietary intervention was quite simple. And you can see from what she was eating previously, she thought that was healthy. Diet drinks, okay? Fruits, loads of fruit, okay? She did have some alcohol and healthy nut, but all of the sort of stuff, We really simplified the food, meat and veg above the ground, switched to full cream dairy. She said, "You're crazy." Anyway, we would generally stop people exercising for the first 4 weeks just to try and stabilize. We couldn't get that through her head at all. So we changed her exercise program to resistance-based 3 to 4 times a week. And in fact, over time, for those of you that understand a little bit more, we've moved more into heavier weights and now really into sort of 1 rep max max type exercise, okay? So real muscle building exercise. So I've put a 2-year set of results up because there's a couple of things I want to show. One is that when she started with us, it took her close to 6 months to become a good fat burner. And we see that commonly, okay? But once she became a good fat burner, weight changed, everything moved on, okay? The other thing I wanted to point out was that she was quite fit already. Don't worry, that number, if it gets up towards 21, means it's bad. If it gets down towards 13, which is where some of the Olympic swimmers we tested are, it's really good. Okay, so she started at 16.85. It's within her whatever the normal range is, and she improved progressively. And exercise is a key driver of that metabolic improvement, a key driver. Okay, I also want to. I've just highlighted the fat mass at the bottom. So the majority of her weight loss came from fat mass. And that was key to what we were doing, okay? Because that's going to give her the best defense going forward, okay? So now at 2015, we've changed the shape of the box. We couldn't get the other one. We've got device approval, we've recertified, we've revalidated the technology. And so ECAL works. We've put a whole bunch of proprietary algorithms in. This technology class is prone to false positives. It's prone to throw out results that you think are good but may not be, okay? So we spent a lot of time developing software that might help a non-specialist allied health worker or clinician develop that, okay? And we have a situation, and we have some reports. This actually is a report from someone you know, okay? A simple patient report. You'll see on the left-hand side that we've added alcohol as a fourth food group. That was absolutely critical here in Australia, okay? We didn't have it, I'm serious, we didn't have it anywhere else. In any other markets we were in, we've now added it into the UK. So it was pervasive, really is. And I speak as someone who really enjoys red wine. And we have a more detailed report with recommendations that go to a practitioner. We have some early customers, but as you might expect, most of those early customers are institutions. We have a significantly less expensive tool that they can use. One of the things that's fascinated me, I'll talk separate another time maybe, is why sports departments have picked it up when we're actually only testing at rest and not under submaximal or stress conditions. Okay, so anyway, moving forward. One of the conversations today, in the last 2 days, and over the last 2 years, and was brilliantly demonstrated by the Verta model, is to put the patient at the center of everything that's going on here. But actually, in our experience, it's really 3 groups that go to make that patient whole. That's the clinician, the dietitian, and here in Australia, we call them the exercise physiologist or the physical trainer, okay? And the reason those 3 people are equally important is because, unfortunately, the way we teach health sciences here, and maybe it's starting to change, and I've heard some stuff from Kieran Rooney and others about how it is starting to change, is it's so siloed that the dietitian has very little understanding of how to interpret a pathology result or exercise structure. The exercise physiologist has, although they might think otherwise, virtually no understanding of the dietary requirement, okay? And the clinician, well, they're a clinician. And I say that with the greatest grace. So we think that testing may well help each of those people develop skills that aren't inherently there. And you guys are all here because you care passionately and want to do that additional work. Many of your colleagues don't or can't. So we see an opportunity. We've called it enable. We want to enable health professionals to have access to the technology in a wider sense. My colleague Martin Siebus, who some of you might know as Macro 4, okay, and our group have been working on this digital health platform that would allow the technology to be local and close to patient, would be low cost, able to fit into the various sort of HL7 fire infrastructures that are required to supply reports. Okay. But the word I want you to go with here and understand is this term metabologist. We see that there's a role for a metabologist. Okay. The metabologist, ideally, and those of you that build undergraduate courses, you should be running one of these. A metabologist understands metabolic health. A metabologist has an equal understanding of the clinical need, the nutritional need, and the exercise need. Okay. Now, it doesn't exist at the moment, so therefore that white space that's there, we hope that we can fill with Enable. So in summary, metabolic testing, we believe, will support individual patient care. Metabolic testing using indirect calorimetry is still considered a gold standard. And what we've done is just move that from research into the clinical field. Metabolic testing needs to be easy and local and accurate and repeatable. And we think that Enable may go some way to do that. So I just have to finish with a word from my sponsors. So this is my wife and son. This is a photograph of our 30th wedding anniversary earlier on this year. Okay, I could not have had this indulgence for the last 10 years without their support. And I just want to leave you with some words, wise words from Kelvin. You know, when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you can do something with it. If you cannot measure it, you really cannot improve it. That's not to say everything that can be measured should, but we believe in this case, those additional metrics will help many, many more people achieve those individual outcomes. Thank you.